sites in history. We have called it our icy past, and we hope you can be transported back 11,000 years to the time when a huge 1,000-foot ice mass started to retreat from Warren County. We are extremely pleased to have lead our tour and slide presentation Mr. Henry M. Skirpst, a senior environmental science major at Stockton State College. Mr. Skirpst was selected by the Warren County Historical and Genealogical Society to receive a grant to study and record the impact of the terminal moraine on Warren County. These findings were presented to the Society in a 46-page report on June 23, 1990. Soon after, it came to the attention of Rosemary Motzenbecker through an article in the Easton Express by Gregory Karp. Rosemary tracked down Mr. Skirpst, and she enticed him with her enthusiasm and some chocolate chip cookies. And he visited her house, and I was present. And we were delighted to help plan this tour to make his research available to our community. The nominal fee we used for the ticket will offset the expenses of our buses and other costs that we had. But it also is going to be used to fund a project at Central School to preserve our portion of the terminal moraine as an outdoor educational site. We are indebted to all of you here today, not only for your interest, but for your contribution to the preservation of our glacial history. We are also indebted to many other people, especially the property owners who have graciously given us permission to visit their sites that ordinarily we would not be able to see. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jim Clark. He's sitting in the rear. And his property, he's the property owner of the Mastodon Pond. Now I'd like to present to you our tour guide, lecturer, and slide presentation person, Mr. Henry M. Skirpst.
For showing up today. It's a beautiful day. We couldn't ask for a nicer autumn day. Beautiful sunshine and a crisp, clear day. Thank you also for Rosemary and Ruth for inviting me and getting in touch with me to put on this bus tour. I think it'll go over pretty well. Let me start off by just giving a brief background as to who I am and how I got involved with this project. I grew up in Harmony Township and graduated from Belvedere High School in 1986. And for the last 4 years, I've been attending Stockton State College down near Atlantic City in South Jersey as an environmental science major. This December, I'm going to be graduating from Stockton and plan on going on to graduate school next year. In March of 1989, the Warren County Historical Society, along with Chuck Hytine, who was then State Assembly Majority Leader, decided to conduct research on the terminal moraine, which is a glacial feature of Warren County, and also associated features. They then contacted me, and I openly accepted doing research for them, and since then, for the last year and a half or so, I've been compiling research. As Ruth said, 46 pages of the terminal moraine and associated features for the Historical Society, and they're used to make nominations to the state of New Jersey for land acquisition for open space. And as Ruth said, this came along with some media coverage, and Rosemary Motzenbecker contacted me, and she gave me some chocolate chip cookies and talked me into doing this tour, which I gladly accepted. I have 3 goals that I'd like to present to you for the bus tour that I'd like you to kind of keep in mind as we go along today. In addition to going out and just looking at the sites, I'd also like you to get an idea of how the sites were created in the first place. Also, to think about these sites in terms of how they impacted upon the local culture. What relevance do they have on who we are today, our cultural history? And thirdly, to become more curious about our surrounding environment, to ask questions, to think about Why does this exist in the first place? How did it get like that? What opportunities and barriers does it present to us today and to our fathers and grandfathers before us? How does it affect me personally? I believe that this is an important skill to develop. And every day we are affected by events which occur in nature, some of which occurred millions of years ago. The recent developments right now over in the Middle East regarding Iraq and Kuwait, probably the primary reason we're involved in that is because Kuwait lies on top of a massive oil reserve. And if you think about it, the oil would not have been there had the area a million years ago not been a swamp, had not existed there. Millions of years ago there was a swamp and the plant matter decayed, and over the course of those years turned into an oil deposit, and that's why the oil is there in the first place, and that's why we're there today. Today we're not going to be looking at any oil deposits with major global impacts, but we are going to be looking at features in the landscape which were created by the ice ages some 18 to 11,000 years ago, and how they've somewhat influenced the local culture of Warren County. Learning about our icy past is one way that we can gain a greater appreciation for nature and how intimately connected we are to it. Let me first give you an idea of how the program will work today. I'll speak shortly of what our icy past is all about, giving a brief summary of what the ice age events are that have created the features we're going to be looking at today. Second, I'm going to give a short slide presentation showing some of the sites we'll be visiting and also some that we won't be visiting, and briefly discuss on how those features came to be about. Finally, I'll give a short summary on how the bus tour itself will work in terms of which sites we're going to be visiting and how we should board the buses and different things like that. First of all, over the past million years, North America has encountered 4 ice ages, 2 of which New Jersey and Warren County have been a part of. The most recent of which was the Wisconsin Ice Age, and it's called that because the deposits were best preserved in the state of Wisconsin, and that's why it's called the Wisconsin Ice Age. This occurred between 18 and 11,000 years ago. It began to melt and recede north, leaving its deposits and debris and features this far south in Warren County. Imagine 1,000 feet of ice, as Ruth had mentioned, scouring over the landscape. You can just picture what kind of impact that would have on the land, scraping away the debris and then depositing it finally at the southernmost point, which is called the terminal moraine. Let me now go to the slide segment of the presentation where I'll show you some of the features which we'll be visiting today. If we could get the lights turned off and the slide projector on, Alex, please. With Warren County highlighted in the upper left-hand corner. If at any time anyone can't hear me, please raise your hand and let me know, because I'm going to have to step away from the mic a little bit. During the Wisconsin Ice Age, the glacial ice spread as far south as the midsection of Warren County through Belvedere and Hackettstown, and extended further south in the eastern part of the state over near Perth Amboy. The reason for this was because the western part of the state is filled with the ridges and valleys that you all know in the Appalachian Mountains, and it impeded the flow of the glacial ice. That's why it spread further in the east. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, if you can make that figure out, that's my little brother. I told him I would point him out on this slide today. Alex. This is just an aerial view of part of Warren County with Mountain Lake in the midground there. I took this last November. I took a flight up with a friend of mine in 1946 Aeronca. It was the first time I had ever flown, and it was a wonderful experience. I was sticking my head out of the window taking some of these pictures. And this just shows you some of the terrain that the ice had to flow over 11,000 years ago. This is a map showing how the glacial ice spread, following basically the ridges and valleys indicated by the black arrows on this map. The green line here indicates the furthest advance of the ice movement 11,000 years ago before the ice began to recede. This line is called the terminal moraine and is a line of debris which was scoured out from the north and deposited along this line as the ice was melting and receding further north. This here is a map of Warren County, and the terminal moraine is indicated by the red slashed line. You can see how it extends from Belvedere in the west to Hackettstown in the east, and right now at the Independence Township School we are located right here, right on the terminal moraine. Various features are associated with the terminal moraine. As I mentioned, it's a line of debris which was scoured out from the north. This is a shot along Route 519 in White Township. It's a hill cut which shows a good cross-section of what the terminal moraine is all about. You can see the large glacially rounded limestone boulders which were tumbled underneath 1,000 feet of ice. And in the background you can see layers of gravel and sand which were also deposited by the glacial ice. The soil itself isn't that productive because it's a relatively young soil and hasn't had that much time, only 11,000 years, which geologically speaking isn't that long, hasn't had that much time to really develop an organic layer. The events of the Ice Age have also had major impacts on the agriculture of New Jersey and the rest of the country as a whole. North of the terminal moraine, indicated here by the green and red line, you can see that the soils are generally classed as poor to very poor. The reason for this is because the soils are very thin, and as I mentioned before, haven't had much time to develop organic layers. South of the moraine, however, indicated by the blue, the soils are much more productive in the valleys of the Musconetcong and the Pequest and the Delaware rivers. This is because they're older soils and are thus much more productive. In the next two slides here, this shot is taken in the Delaware Valley near Belvedere in the background here, and there's Belvedere High School, my alma mater. And this shows you how in the valley the agricultural fields were much larger because of the productive soils, whereas in the next slide, which is taken north of the terminal moraine, you can see how the agricultural fields are much smaller because the soils are thinner and they're filled with more rocks transported by the glacial ice. This is a shot of Mountain Lake over in Hope Township, and this is the largest lake of glacial origin in Warren County. While the Ice Age was at its maximum, it had scoured out a basin which Mountain Lake now exists in. And at the southern edge of Mountain Lake is where the terminal moraine has impeded the flow of Mountain Lake Brook. This is why the lake exists, because it did not have an opportunity to empty out. And this feature has had major impacts on the recreational and economic factors of Warren County and would not exist were it not for the Ice Age. This here is a kettle pond, and we're going to be seeing one kettle pond today, Mastodon Pond, which I'll refer to later. A kettle pond is created when large masses of ice, chunks of ice, break off from the advancing ice sheet and are consequently buried by the outwashed debris, the sands and the gravels, as the ice was melting back. Over centuries, that chunk of ice would melt, and the result would be a depression in the landscape. Some of these depressions were deep enough to fall below the water table and thus filled with water, creating kettle ponds. These kettle ponds dot the terminal moraine across Warren County. As I was flying last November in the plane taking shots for this project, I flew over the Great Meadows area, and Pequest Valley looked like a big green lake. And that's not too far from the truth, because 11,000 years ago, the Pequest Valley was an ancient glacial lake. It was dammed up by the terminal moraine, which is out of view to the south here, and it was a large, expansive, shallow lake where over centuries, aquatic plants decayed and settled to the bottom, creating a rich organic soil, which in some places is over 15 feet deep. It wasn't until the 1800s where it was finally drained out and utilized for agriculture, because it is a very rich organic soil. This is a shot along Cemetery Road in Independence Township, which we'll be driving by today. It's a shot of the Peak West Gorge. To the right, you can see the terminal moraine and the graphic relief here extending to the left where the Peak West River runs. This was at the southern edge of the ancient glacial lake, and this is where the Peak West River cut through the terminal moraine, enabling the waters to drain out of the glacial lake. And as I said, this is one of the sites we'll drive by today. The hill here exists as a result of the Peak West River cutting through, and it continues to cut through the terminal moraine even today. The terminal moraine also served as a very important network for Indian travel. As I mentioned, it extended over the Great Meadows, the swampy areas, and provided a network for which the Indians utilized to travel over because it was easier than trudging through 15 feet of muck. The terminal moraine, indicated here by the red and green line, extends all the way across the state. And as you can see, this is the Monunkichunk Trail. It's a branch of the Minising Trail. And the Minising Trail is a very famous Indian trail which travels the extent of the terminal moraine all the way down to Perth Amboy. Colonists utilized this trail early on when they were first settling Warren County, and eventually they began to turn into wagon trails, and over time, when the railroad industry came about, they turned into railroads. Today, there are several abandoned railway grades that exist in Warren County. This is one shot over in White Township of an abandoned grade, which travels the extent of the terminal moraine. This is a map here of the terminal moraine blown up in Warren County. The Delaware River is over here with Belvedere, and the Musconetcong and Hackettstown are over here. This is just a shot of the different sites, some of which we'll be visiting today. There's 4 that we're going to be visiting today: Mastodon Pond, Great Meadows Overlook, road cut on Route 46, and the Peak West Gorge on Cemetery Road. We're located right here on 46 in Independence Township. Mastodon Pond is along Asbury Road over here. That will be the first site we'll be going to. Then we'll be traveling up to Hope Road, overlooking the Great Meadows, looking at various features there. And then coming back along Route 46 to an area right in here near J&H Trucking, which shows a good example of a road cut, and then traveling back to the Peak West Gorge here, and then back to the school. And if we can get the lights, that's the last slide. Everyone, I believe, has a copy of the tour guide. If not, there's extra copies back by the back table. I encourage all of you, before you go out, if you haven't already, to take a look at the bulletin board that Rosemary and Ruth have worked on so diligently for the last 2 months. It's really impressive. And there's also a lot of literature and whatnot to look at on the back table there. I encourage you also to ask questions if there's anything that interests you or anything that you need to question. I'm open to questions at all times during the bus tour and right now if you have any. I'd like to turn it over shortly to Rosemary Matzenbecker. She has a few things to say before we go out to the buses.
Okay. Ruth Gatch introduced you to Jim Clark, the owner of the Mastodon Pond, who was very eager to have all of you come out on his property to see the pond. However, there aren't too many of us today who would want so many people on their private property. And he is very cautious, and he would like to warn you of a few hazards on his property. And he wants to assure that you will have a safe trip on his private property. So he has asked me to read this to you. Mastodon Pond is located approximately 700 feet south of Asbury Road. Due to the irregular shape of the driveway, buses will have to be parked on or near Asbury Road, which will require each person desiring to see the pond to walk this distance. Please be advised of the following hazards. 1, up and down slope of the land, namely the driveway and area between the pond and the existing home. 2, irregular driveway surface, including rocks, rain-formed trenches, fallen branches, etc. 3, invisible mole underground trenches in front of the house. 4, irregular width of steps leading to deck just south of the pond. Should you feel threatened by any of the above or any other environmental potential problem, you are requested to remain on the bus. While everyone is welcome to view this historical site, the owner of the property will not assume any liability for any accidents or bodily injury that might occur on the Clark property located at 46 Asbury Road, Hackettstown, New Jersey. Thank you. Also, if anyone needs to, the bathrooms are right outside here before we board the bus. And everyone should have a copy of our IC Pass, and the buses should be outside.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, would have been 2 minutes later. Introduced all the athletes and the parents. We got there, you pinned the flower, we said bye, Fred. We went one way and that. Yes. But that was male and a female. I don't see what he's doing.
North, big chunks would fall off and be covered by the outwash with sand and gravel. In this very spot, one big chunk of ice fell off from the main ice sheet, and over centuries, the ice chunk melt and resulted in this depression. It was deep enough in this area to fall below the water table. And as you see today, this Kettle Pond is a reminder of our icy past. Around that time, the landscape in this area was very Arctic-like. It was much cooler than it is today, and large prehistoric Pleistocene mammals roamed the land. In this spot, 6 mastodons, for whatever reason, met their demise here. Maybe they were just taking a drink of water, maybe they were being hunted by the primitive man. But in this very spot, in 1844, in the very month of October, as we are here, 6 mastodons were uncovered by a gentleman named Abram Ayers, who uncovered, while he was digging around looking for fertilizer, the rich organic material he was going to use on his farm. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see how the pond's regularly shaped circular features are kind of jutted out. Mr. Clark thinks that this is the area in which the mastodon was uncovered, because it's kind of irregular in that area. The remains were found between 4 and 6 feet deep in the muck, and in 1846, Harvard Museum acquired the remains, and the best preserved mastodon now exists on display. It's called the Cambridge Mastodon, and it's on display in the Harvard Museum of Comparative Anatomy and Physiology. If there's any questions at this time, please. Okay, they named it the Cambridge Mastodon because Harvard College used to be called Cambridge College, and it's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's why they called it Cambridge Mastodon. They should have called it Jim Clark's Mastodon or Warren County's Mastodon, but they did call it Cambridge Mastodon. It was the 4th best preserved specimen in the country at that time. There were only 3 others on display when they found this one. Yes? I'm not aware of that. I don't really know. I'll have to check that out. At Centenary College, you said? Right. As I mentioned, there were 6 remains uncovered here, only one of which was the complete remains and is on...
See? $1,000 bills just flooded from it.
Can everyone hear me all right? Can it be louder? Is that all right? So 11,000 years ago, around the same time the Pleistocene mammals, the mastodons, were beginning to die out, this area here was an ancient glacial lake, dammed up by the terminal moraine, which is to the south. And if you look out into the horizon, you can see that land, which is called Post Island. It has a house on top of it, jutting out of the flat landscape. That area was probably surrounded by water and was an area where the early Indians, the early prehistoric men, went to inhabit because of the surrounding water. It was an ideal location for their placement. This lake existed for centuries, and over that time period, the aquatic plants, the vegetation that inhabited it, died and settled to the bottom, just like a normal lake today. And over that period of time, the deposits accumulated to be a depth of, in some places, the soil here is 16 feet deep, the rich black organic soils. It wasn't until 1876, after many numerous failed attempts to drain this valley, that a gentleman named Aram Day invested over $100,000, which was a substantial sum of money in the 1800s. This project was initiated in order to drain out, to dredge the Pequest River and empty the swampy waters which existed in the valley. He did this in order to utilize the thick organic muck soil to use for agricultural purposes. As you see here today, these sod farms require the rich organic soil which exists. Before it was drained out, however, the area was infested with many insects, like mosquitoes, which infest many of the swamps around the county today. And at that time, many of the early colonists and the early Indians lost their lives. And it's speculated that the local name road of Shades of Death Road to the north here, which many of you are probably familiar with, that's one of the legends behind how Shades of Death Road got its name. If there's any questions regarding Pequest Valley here, the Great Meadows Overlook, or any of the other features that we've seen previous, please ask at this time. Yes?
Referencing your written material about the caves,
Yes?
is that one of them?
Good point. That hill jutting out, Post Island, is in fact a cave. Now a cave, this is actually a partially buried cave. A cave is a result of the ice sheet scouring over the land, and if you can imagine that ice picking up all that dirty material, there's a lot of material, a lot of deposits carried in the ice, and when it began to melt, the deposits would settle out. And in some areas, like Post Island here, they settled out and formed a mound, which resulted in Post Island and separated it from the flat lands of around it. This is an excellent example of a cave. There's several others scattered along the terminal moraine in Warren County which aren't as good as this one here. But this is an excellent example because it's on the flat valley and it really juts out from the flat land. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, this site here, as well as a hill cut along 519 in White Township, as well as several others in the county along the terminal moraine, shows the cross-section of what the terminal moraine actually is. As you can see, there's different layers. You can see the darker black silty material in the middle and larger till, the rounded stones on both the upper and lower sides of it. This here shows what happened 11,000 years ago when the ice scoured from the north to the south, stopping right here, leaving all of this debris in a line of debris called the terminal moraine, stretching from Belvedere to Hackettstown in Warren County. Features such as this along the terminal moraine have had a somewhat dramatic influence on the economics of Warren County. This site, as well as Pio Costa and Harmony Sand and Gravel and various other sites, have taken advantage of the debris which has been left behind in utilizing it for the sands and the gravels or whatever they've dug it out for. Another interesting point is that Thomas Edison used a site in Warren County to create the first concrete road in the country. And the reason he located out here in Warren County was because we have these deposits left over from the Wisconsin Ice Age. So in many different ways, this feature has had impacts on our historical culture and the history of the area. If there's any questions about this site, please ask now. Otherwise, the next site that we're going to be going to, we're not going to be stopping. It's a site called the Pequest Gorge along Cemetery Road. And I'll be in the lead bus, and we'll slow down when we go by the site, but we won't be stopping. We'll just be going by it and then back to the school. The Pequest Gorge is the site in which the Pequest River cut through the terminal moraine, what you see here, and drained out the ancient glacial lake, which we saw at the site previous to this, in the Great Meadows Overlook. You'll be able to see a dramatic hill on the right following the cemetery once we go by it, and then we'll cross over a bridge over which goes over the Pequest River. Are there any questions at all regarding this site or the next one? Yes?
Why don't you point out the swallow at this hillside? Don't you like, those little holes?
Okay, there is a comment made to point out the holes in the darker material over here to the right. What that is a bunch of bank swallows burrowing into the terminal moraine. And so in that respect, this feature also affects the natural world, the wildlife in the area.
Hey guys, here we are.